Hello and welcome to Roadmap 2023, our election issues and personalities tracking program. I'm Ladi Akeredoluale. Thanks for joining us. The national economy, its prospects and challenges, particularly what the key points that the next administration must tackle to improve the fortunes of the economy are, is our focus today. My guest says mass unemployment, exacerbated by low productivity and massive corruption, has led the country to being home to more than 130 million people who live in multidimensional poverty. My guest believes to address this, the next administration will have to reschedule the nation's national debt, which he puts at about $100 billion, as well as remove the subsidy on petrol to free up necessary funds to pursue other economic imperatives. Roadmap 2023 talks to political economist, former deputy governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, who has just withdrawn from partisan politics and is now president of the Institute for Governance and Economic Transformation, Professor Kingsley Moghalu. Professor Kingsley Moghalu, thank you for your time. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Laddie.
Today, I know that you have announced formally your withdrawal at this point from partisan politics. So our discussion today is going to be focused still on politics, but essentially on whoever it is that emerges Nigeria's leader post the elections in 2023 will have to tackle, particularly on the economic front. There has been so much in terms of discussions about what it is that the country faces. But to start off, broadly speaking, how would you characterize the country's economic situation as of today?
Nigeria's economic situation is extremely gloomy and extremely grim. I do not pity whoever, or I pity rather, whoever will become the next president, because he will inherit an economy that has essentially collapsed. Our public debt stock is about almost 100 billion US dollars, over 44 trillion naira. A lot of people in Nigeria are poor. About 133 million live in multidimensional poverty, which I actually think is the most important issue that needs to be addressed. We also have, issues of security which affect the economy. So, for example, we have very high inflation, because of, food prices. Many people in areas of the country that have food baskets cannot go to their farms now because of security issues. And so prices of food are going up uncontrollably. And this is a very big problem as well. So we have issues of debt, issues of poverty, issues of inflation, issues of unemployment, which is 33%, and youth unemployment is over 50%. So when you look at the ingredients of this stew, it does make up a very potent stew in a negative sense. And so whoever will become the next president will have to, apart from security, which is fundamental also, focus very heavily on issues of poverty and the economy.
Given that you talk about the fact that the poverty level, the multi-dimensional nature of the nation's poverty to you would appear to be one of the most serious problems that the new leader will be faced with. Perhaps we could delve a bit deeper in that. First of all, what is the nature of this poverty in a way that exemplifies or explains how come Nigeria has become, the virtual poverty capital of the world. I mean, it was, then it got overtaken by India at a point, and then we got back the crown, and then, in between, at some point, the figure, as you've noted, is 133 million. How did we get here?
Well, we got here because of very weak economic thinking. A lot of our governments make one mistake. First of all, they tend to focus on just economic growth, GDP growth. They don't focus enough on poverty. And even on the GDP growth they're focusing on, we have not done very well either for the last several years. But you see, what about GDP per capita? What does the average Nigerian earn? You know, when you divide the total GDP by the population, that is what matters even more. And so this is how we got here. We have not invested in education and skills. We have not invested in healthcare. These are specific areas of social infrastructure, human development, potable drinking water. These are the basics that determine whether you're living the life of a civilized human being or you're living like a beast, even though you say you're a human being. And that's what our leaders do not focus on. They have not come to understand that, tackling poverty and taking millions of people out of poverty into the middle class is the most important function for them. And so they talk about economic growth. Our economy grew this percent, that percent. To me, that's a secondary discussion, you see. So we have not invested in the things we should invest. We do not have electric power that can, help people to do businesses profitably without spending half of their costs on energy charges. This is, of course, a very important issue as well. So we need to invest very heavily in literacy, in education, in skills that can allow people to create their own jobs. Then when you look at certain aspects of the Nigerian poverty trap, as you know, the Institute for Governance and Economic Transformation, the think tank that I founded and head, recently issued a report that many people have described as a seminal report on the Nigerian poverty trap and how to end it, more importantly. Because we all know that we have problems of poverty, but the question is, what do we do? So, and when we look at the nature of the Nigerian poverty trap, there's some very peculiar things to it. One of the peculiar aspects of the Nigerian poverty trap is the matter of uncontrolled population growth. This is one of the things that drive poverty in Nigeria, but we have not taken any action on managing the growth of our population for decades. And so we're not even addressing the fundamental issues. So many people are having children, the population is growing, but the population is growing, but the economy is not growing. Normally, economic growth should be more than population growth. But where population growth is more than economic growth, which is what we've had in Nigeria for many, many, many years, that is a recipe for creating or bringing children into the world who will be not just poor, but intergenerationally poor, because their parents are illiterate. Because those parents are illiterate and poor, those children will also not receive the kind of education and acquire the skills they need, and so they become beggars on the streets, or they're used for child labor. And so they themselves, because they're not empowered, will grow up in poverty and have children in poverty. That's another cycle of poverty. So the implication of this is that by 2030, as many reports say, most of the people who are extremely poor in the world will be living in Nigeria or the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is not a very good projection for us, because our population is projected it will get to about 400 million people by 2050. And if many of them are uneducated, if most of them are poor, then you're going to have what we call a youth bulge. So we're not having a demographic dividend. We're going to have a demographic bump. You can have a large population if that population is skilled, if it is educated, if people are employed and can find jobs and grow the economy and take themselves out of poverty. But if you have a large population, as we have in Nigeria, of mostly unemployed youth, and people are breeding children like rabbits with no controls, then what you're cooking is a very, very poisonous pot of soup. So this is the nature of the Nigerian poverty trap. Another aspect of the nature of the Nigerian poverty trap is that it has a lot of gender implications. Over 60% of the people who are poor in Nigeria are women. More people who are poor live in the rural areas than in the urban areas. Now, if you look at the discriminations against women in Nigeria and how that perpetuates poverty, more women than men work in the farms and in agriculture, and yet, which is, the mainstay of the Nigerian economy, and yet many of them do not have access to land, they do not have access to credit or capital, and the nature of agriculture in most of the country is mostly subsistence farming. It's not really value chain agriculture. So there are some very specific issues in the Nigerian poverty trap. Then you have the cocktail of inflation, a very low minimum wage, and then unemployment. So when you look at these things, you see that the Nigerian poverty trap is a very, very deep trap indeed. And to get out of it is going to need very serious thinking and action. I stress thinking before action. We act a lot without thinking deeply. And we think we're running around, we're solving the problem. We're seen to be doing something, setting up committees, doing this, but we don't measure our results. But we don't assess our success with our various policies and hold ourselves accountable.
In your opening statement there, you mentioned the issue of debt. You talked about debt being about $100 billion or about $100 billion or about 44 trillion naira. Now, anyone who is going to do anything about any of the various issues, be it education, health, the multidimensional nature of the poverty, bringing down inflation, will need resources to do so. But as it is today, even by the current government's admission, we are spending virtually everything we earn on debt service, not repayments, but just servicing, which is an entirely existential problem going forward. So what would you ask, what would you think that whoever is coming in, whoever is campaigning to come in and so on should have as an idea of what they need to do beyond simply saying, well, we will renegotiate it? In concrete terms, how do you go about that?
Well, you have to begin what we call debt restructuring, which is really how to restructure the debt, change the terms, put off the payments, spread it out more, and maybe lower what you're paying back. Now, those things are very, very intricate and complicated negotiations, and they must be conducted by people who have the expertise. The first thing the next president must do is that the Nigerian economy has to be run by competent experts, not by just politicians. You see? So, for example, the ministries that have to do with these things like finance, like industry and investment, like national planning, those kinds of issues, areas, it must not be about politics. It has to be about who can get the job done. And that's what the next president has to understand. So the debt negotiations and debt restructuring is number one. The very important next step is to curb the waste and the corruption and the stealing in the Nigerian government. If you have $700 million or $800 million or $1 billion a month being stolen from crude oil theft, that means that Nigeria will not have money that should rightfully be the government's money to do some of these things. So the corruption, the waste, the Nigerian treasury is being spent on maintaining politicians, maintaining public institutions, and it's not being invested in things like education, in things like healthcare, So that's one other big thing that we must do. We must cut down the cost of government. The cost of government in Nigeria is humongous, and corruption walks on four legs. And that corruption takes away a lot of the resources that the federal government and the state governments can invest in fighting poverty or even just meeting their obligations. Then there must be tax reform. The federal government must become much more effective in the area of taxation. There are about 70 to 80 million people in Nigeria who ought to be paying tax. And I can tell you that not more than 15 million people pay tax. If we can get another 30 million even into the tax bracket, paying tax, but not high taxes. I keep stressing this because the government is not delivering much for what people pay in taxation. So this makes people not want to pay their tax because they don't trust the government. So, but if the government can show that it is beginning to be serious in delivering the kinds of basic things that people require in their lives, then people will be more willing to pay taxes. Many more people paying low taxes will give the Nigerian government a very much improved fiscal position. More money to do more things or do things better. So that's another suggestion. The other issue, of course, so I've talked about debt restructuring. I've talked about generating revenues, and then we need to
curbing wastage.
Yes, cutting wastage. So we also need to stop using borrowed money or even our money to engage in so-called infrastructure projects, especially big mega projects that serve the urban areas. You can do that through public-private partnership deals so that the money that the federal government has or the state governments have can go into rural infrastructure, investing in rural infrastructure. So, this is a very important way, again, to conserve fiscal resources. Don't tell us you're borrowing to spend on infrastructure. And most of that infrastructure is, except in very rare cases, is not self-sustaining because, like the railways and all of that, we have no evidence that they're self-sustaining, you see? And some of that infrastructure, it just doesn't, the investment case is not there for borrowing and spending in infrastructure that does not generate what you will use to pay back your debt. So therefore, most of those kinds of infrastructures should be done by the private sector. Let them invest and make their money back in a deal with the government. And after some years, 2025, it becomes that of the government to own and to run. This is the best way to go for most of the mega projects. So don't tell us you're borrowing to pay for those things. That's just very weak economic thinking. So these are some of the very specific things that I would recommend to the next government.
One of the, if you like, political hot potatoes or economic hot potatoes that whoever is taking over will be almost immediately confronted with is what is happening as you and I are speaking. You are in Washington, but perhaps you would probably have been told that there are many queues in many parts of Nigeria for people looking for petrol. And this is still in a country where its refining capacity is close to zero. The refineries are not really working, and yet we're paying humongous sums. In 2022, it's estimated that by the end, we would have paid some 4 to 5 trillion naira in subsidy on this same petrol that it seems as if many people cannot find. But then there is the economic argument for subsidy. There's the social welfare argument for it. And I know you're familiar with both of them because this is not a new issue. Where exactly do you think the next leader should keep his focus and look towards attending to this problem? Because attend to it, he or she will have to.
Well, it's a major issue, which of course I did not mention in my other recipes, but I'm glad that we have come to it. We've been kicking the can down the road for too long. Leadership is not just about a position, holding power or holding a position. Leadership is about delivering results. It's about mobilizing the consensus of citizens around tackling the very difficult challenges that any society will face, especially the Nigerian government and Nigerian society. The subsidy must go. There is no economic case for subsidizing petrol consumption in Nigeria. And we all know that almost half of what is spent in subsidy, in my own estimation, is a fraud. Complete and utter fraud. It's a racket that has existed for decades. Cabals have been formed around it. And then when you say you want to remove the subsidy, people go and organize the Nigerian Labour Congress and students and all of these things. No. 4 to 5 trillion naira a year on petrol subsidy is what makes the government of Nigeria unable to deliver its constitutional mandate on the welfare, the security and welfare of Nigerians shall be the primary purpose of government. That's in the Constitution. But like I said, they're not able to invest in education, they're not able to invest in healthcare, they're not able to invest in water and sanitation for people, poor people, because they're spending their money on the wrong things. So the subsidy has to go. Any of the presidential candidates who does not understand this is not ready to make any impact in Nigeria's economy and poverty. But of course, it will have consequences when subsidy is removed, because the price of petrol will go up. I have always made the suggestion that instead of spending 4 to 5 trillion naira on subsidy every year, if you invested 500 billion naira wisely, the federal government, working in collaboration with state governments, can come out with a subsidized public transportation system in all the 774 local government areas in Nigeria. Something that will help the poor to cushion the immediate impact of the removal of the subsidy. This is where the thinking should be going. Yes, we will remove subsidy, but how can we ensure that we help the poor to cope with it as much as possible? If you spent a fraction of that money, even if you spent $1 trillion, and you don't have to spend $1 trillion, Nigerians inflate projects a lot because politicians are corrupt. To do this, it's a much better investment. And you could still have 3 trillion naira every year to spend on a lot of other things. So we have to work out a subsidized nationwide transportation system. Whether it will, that's why I said it has to be in collaboration between the federal government and the state governments, because at the local levels, it's for the states to manage those things. We have too much of the federal government, the federal capital, the Abuja syndrome. Trying to manage a large country like Nigeria from Abuja does not work. This is something that will have to be managed state by state, local government by local government. So we need this type of thinking, we need this type of policy, and it has to work well. Not to announce it in the newspaper and then it doesn't work on the ground. No. So this is very necessary. But as for the subsidy, it must go. Because if it doesn't go, Nigeria cannot survive economically.
Let me bring you to some of the policy issues now. The people talk about the marriage between macro and microeconomic policy. Nigeria is mainly import dependent in spite of all the attempts down the years to improve that situation. And that has given primacy of place to the issue of foreign exchange. And then there again, you have the policy of dual or multiple exchange rates, which is also distorting prices within the local economy. So you find that because we are import dependent, we have no control over whatever prices we are paying for goods that are mostly imported and services which also have foreign components in it. Now, how does one go about using policy initiatives to address this? Because we are supposed to be a capitalist economy, so we're supposed to allow the forces of demand and supply determine these things. But then that also seems not to be quite working because it's a hodgepodge of things that are being implemented at the same time.
Yeah. Again, like I said, the economy of Nigeria needs serious thinking through. It needs a strong intellects. It needs people with experience, with knowledge. And then there must be the political will of the president and the elected political leaders in the National Assembly and so on to support the reforms that are necessary to make our economy work for us as Nigerians. So let us come to the question of foreign exchange. It has been badly managed. Foreign exchange policy in this country in the last several years has been badly managed, and we have seen the consequences in the near total destruction of the economy, the inflation, much of which is avoidable, and so on. You cannot have multiple exchange rates. Once you have multiple exchange rates, you are creating room for arbitrage. That is to say that some people will get it at the lower price and go and maximize their opportunities with the market price. That's the first thing that must go. So all this is about the central bank because the central bank manages the forex. So it's very important that, unfortunately, of course, we know what happened with the central bank in this era. We know that the central bank fell victim or captive or actually sold itself, whichever is the case, to political control and political direction. And once a central bank makes decisions that are directed by politicians, that central bank can never manage the economy of whatever country successfully. It is just intrinsic in the nature of central banking that it must be independent and professional if a central bank is to achieve its goals. So forex policy, we cannot have, government rates and market rates and investor rates and education school fees rates and all these things. There's a lack of transparency. And the fact of the matter is that some people will cash in on that absence of transparency. People will use political connections, get money they will give the central bank official reasons why they need money at so and so rate, and they will take that money and they will take most of it and go and sell on the black market. So some of the presidential candidates have made it very clear that they will not support. I know that Atiku has made it clear. I know that Peter Obi has made it very clear that they will not support multiple exchange rates. That's a good political stand to take because it shows that some of these candidates are thinking in the right way. Yes, about the matter of the foreign exchange, about how the economy should be managed. So because we're an import-dependent country, the matter of forex is very critical. But going beyond this, how do we move from being an import-dependent economy to an export-led industrial economy, which is what should be the ambition of the next government, or at least to set the foundation for it? There you come back to the matter of education and skills. Again, there is nothing like investing in human capital. One of the major reasons that China was able to take 800 million of its citizens from poverty into the middle class in 40 years was that even in the years in which they were poor, they were always investing in the education and the skills of Chinese citizens. So when the government now came with policy that opened up the economy, For example, stopping the state ownership of land and allowing individuals and groups to own land privately for their farming and agricultural activities. The people had the skills to embrace these opportunities. So the problem we have in Nigeria is that we don't have the education and the skills, and we don't have the right policies. And then, of course, we have serious constitutional problems that prevent our economy from becoming, developed. Now, if you want to develop an export-led economy, because it is that export, if you have massive exports of value-added products, not exports of raw cashew nut or exports of yam tubers, those things can do, but it's not, they cannot help you structurally in terms of the nature of your economy. What we have to be exporting is things that are manufactured in Nigeria competitively. But for you to manufacture competitively in Nigeria, you must address the infrastructure problem, especially of electric power. Because if people's costs, manufacturing costs, 40% of it is coming from their running generators, they must reflect those costs in the prices of the products. And if they reflect those costs in the prices of the products, and people are importing from China at half the price of locally manufactured goods, what do you think will happen? So you have to address this problem at the root. Then you also have to use trade policy. There must be some element of protectionism of the Nigerian economy, but it's not done by closing borders. Those are crude and ineffective policies because people will go into smuggling. Once you use a policy that is state-directed and is not efficiently enforced, Nigeria has hundreds of unmanned border posts. All you're doing is creating a market for smugglers. But if you say that imported things that we can manufacture in Nigeria, you can import, go ahead and import. But you must pay a certain level of tariff on your imports. That way, only people who are very wealthy can use the things that you import. And then you now have policy that enables the financial institutions to support exports, manufacturing and exports with incentives. Then you're beginning to alter the economy in terms of its, structural weight. Yes. So this is what we have to focus on going into the next phase, under the next dispensation. What kinds of skills are needed to turn the Nigerian economy into a complex manufacturing and productive economy? And how do we can start with agriculture, because agriculture is about 30% of the Nigerian economy, GDP, nearly 30%, and employs more than 30% of Nigerians, So, no, even far more than that. Now, when you come to agriculture, and this must be done by the private sector, the government in Nigeria tries to do too much, and they end up doing too little or doing nothing. When you look at agriculture, we have to go through the value chains: cultivation, harvest, transportation, storage, processing, export. We have to create an enabling environment for private sector investments in each of these value chains. There can be whole companies just dedicated to the transportation of agricultural products. There can be whole companies dedicated to storage in specific areas of the country. There can be whole companies dedicated to harvesting, industrially produced agricultural goods. And then we have to look at innovation in agriculture. How can we use more and more and more of seedlings that have very high yields over low acreage, smaller plots of land, but they can produce several times a year, for example. So these are the kinds of things that we need to be looking at in a systemic way. and to create the enabling environment. Nigeria has very talented entrepreneurs, no question about it. So the government doesn't need to do too much except to actually create the policies and the environment that enable people to exploit opportunities in the market and therefore create wealth for themselves and for others. Because the more they can do, well, the more people they can employ. So this is the way I think about the matter of forex, the matter of the import dependence in the Nigerian economy. We need to just think about these things very differently. But the independence of the central bank, for example, as far as forex is concerned, and the management of inflation and all these other things that are the functions of the central bank specifically, the currency, the management of the naira, all of those things need to be respected. And, the bank needs, in my view, a much more enabling environment and, in my view, much more competent leadership.
In most recent times, there have been several policy initiatives, if you like, new things introduced.
Yeah.
And of course, it has raised a little bit of controversy in terms of timing, in terms of objective, and so on. I mean, we had the redesigning of the naira. We were told that, of course, the naira by law is supposed to be redesigned every decade. So we're already behind. We ought to have redesigned it a while back. That came along,
Sure.
and that was still being digested when the whole issue of cash withdrawal limits were introduced, both for corporates and for individuals, and that was ongoing as well. And people were beginning to ask the question, what exactly is the objective behind all of this? And a number of people pointed to the fact that, look, some of these things are done in more developed countries. And then while all that was going on, the third one happened, which was that, look, the government hinted through the NFIU that it was going to stop cash withdrawals from public accounts, that is, accounts of government operated by government agencies and parastatals. Again, it seemed as if it was a triple whammy, all coming one after the other, and perhaps not enough time to digest all of that. Did you understand what this was about? And are these policies that fit in terms of how you grow an economy?
Well, I think I understand what at least the intention of these policies were. I supported the central bank's Naira redesign policy. The problem with our public policy in Nigeria is that we are too knee-jerk. We roll out and try to execute public policy as if we're in a military garrison or in a military barracks. And so oftentimes there's not enough time given for things to actually seep in properly and for policies to be executed in a way that actually achieves their result. And so this also creates the impression, as rightly or wrongly, as if there are political motives behind certain public policies, even though those policies may be rightfully that of the central bank to make. But it is about the execution, the windows that are given. Are they too short? Are they, many countries do these things, but you will never see controversy about it. And that's because they're well thought through and executed over some time. The United Kingdom has just put the picture of King Charles. They've just done a currency redesign because the Queen is dead. There's a new king. And by their own law and culture, the sovereign's head must be on the currency. They've done this, but everybody has not been given 1 month or 2 weeks or 3 or even 2 months to get this new currency. No, the old currency is still in use, but they will phase in from next year the new Bank of England note with the bust of King Charles on it. There's no controversy. So in Nigeria, for example, the currency redesign I think, you know, was not given enough time. But then some people would say that Nigeria is a very peculiar economy, that actually, if you give too much time, the crooks will find a way to get around the policy. Maybe. And then the second whammy, as you talked about the triple whammy, the second whammy of, I think, the currency redesign issue, for me, there was nothing controversial about it other than the matter of timing and how much time is given to transfer to the newly designed notes, which seemed to me, the window seemed a bit short to me. But in terms of the aim of the policy and all that, I think it was correct, and I defended it. And people were talking about informing this person or that person. You find that a lot of people just are illiterate about how a central bank functions or should function. And they think it's some ministry of the government and all of that. The central bank is not a ministry. It's not a department. It's not a parastatal. It's not an agency. You know, it's not an MBA. It's an independent statutory corporation. You know, so now, but let's come to the second one. And that is this matter of the cash withdrawal limits. You know, I felt, although I understood the reason behind the decision, I felt personally that the limit of 100,000 naira withdrawal a week for individuals was too draconian. Because when you are making policy, what are you trying to achieve? Are you criminalizing cash now? Are we saying that the legal tender cash is now criminal to use cash? That's the unintended message, the way some of these policies are thrown out. And I don't think so. There's no law that bans the use of cash in Nigeria. It's just regulated, you know, because although if we say we're going electronic, which I support and many people support, the reason why electronic transactions are better is that they can always easily be traced. And so you can manage, you can fight corruption, but you see, what's the major function of the central bank? Is the major function of the central bank to stop politicians using cash to buy votes? Of course, I don't support politicians using cash to buy votes, but how should this be tackled? Of course, the policies around cash withdrawals affect or can have implications for politicians in the 2023 election. Yes, I agree. But if you are saying that, oh, this policy is good because it will prevent the politicians from buying votes, but it actually also creates a situation in which it's becoming as if for the millions of Nigerians who are not politicians and who are not buying anybody, they have difficulties with living their lives because of a cash withdrawal policy, then, as we now see, the central bank has had to cave in and modify the policy. But why did it not think this through from the beginning? Why do we have these policy somersaults every day or every other day? It does not show robust, in-depth thinking. It shows knee-jerk reaction. We have to do this, you know, and then we're running around like we're in a military garrison. And the central bank is the garrison commander. You know, I don't think an economy should be managed in this way. So, you know, and all these things are all coming at or very close to the elections. Again, it creates a very political and of course there were reactions, and most of the reactions and some of the very powerful reactions were from powerful politicians. What if this had been done 6 months ago? Why didn't the central bank do it 6 months ago? Why does it have to wait until close to the elections to be doing these things? These are some of the issues that I have. And then you talk about the government's policy now, stopping the withdrawal of cash from government accounts. I think it's a very good policy. That I can subscribe to totally and utterly, completely. Why should government agencies be running around with bundles of cash? It doesn't happen anywhere in the civilized world. So that's a policy that is actually long overdue. So those are my reactions to the triple whammy, as you have put it.
As I put it. Indeed, it's a good place to hang it. Professor Kingsley Moghalu, thank you so much for your perspective and for your time on the program today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ladi. Thank you for having me.
That's our program today. Would, of course, like to hear from you on the conversation. Our social media handles are right there on your screen. You can also listen to this and previous episodes of the program via our podcast. Please visit our website, channelstv.com, to get started. I am Ladi Akeredoluale. Goodbye.